Hi, I'm Eric Rivet, Chief Curator of the Western Reserve Historical Society, and today we'll be taking a look at William McKinley, 25th President of the United States, born 1843 in Niles, Ohio. He is usually considered to be the first modern American president, and like many of the Ohio presidents, he's another one with a tragic story. So let's jump right in. So here's a young McKinley, and he was part of a large family. In fact, he was the seventh of nine children. Went to school in and around Niles. His family kind of moved around a little bit. Ended up going to college at Allegheny College in Pennsylvania, but he was only there for a year. He got sick and ended up coming back home. So by 1860, he's back in Ohio and has a job as a postal clerk. So he's just kind of taking what jobs he can to support his family. Like so many other men we've talked about in this series, the Civil War caught him in his youth. And so in 1861, he joins up in the Union Army. Now, of the presidents from Ohio that we've talked about in this series, McKinley is unique in that he is the only one of these men who went into the Union Army during the Civil War as an enlisted man. So he started out as a private, where all the other men we've talked about started out as officers. So let's take a look at McKinley during the Civil War. So Hayes enlists in the 23rd Ohio Infantry under the command of Rutherford B. Hayes, another Ohio president that we've already discussed. And very early in his service, McKinley becomes part of the Quartermaster Corps. So he's responsible for issuing supplies. By April 1862, he is a commissary sergeant, which means he's now responsible for issuing rations, hardtack, coffee, that sort of thing. And it's in that capacity that he has his most famous moment of the Civil War in his biggest battle, and that is Antietam in 1862. And if you're at all familiar with the Battle of Antietam, the 23rd was on the southern end of the field, not too far from what is now known as Burnside's Bridge. And the 23rd was under heavy fire for a good part of the afternoon. They were basically pinned down. And soldiers recalled looking back and seeing a wagon racing through fields straight at them, and it was McKinley. And even during the Battle of Antietam, he rode his wagon up to the line to issue rations and coffee to the men of the 23rd. So he really made a name for himself at the Battle of Antietam. He was sent back to Ohio after the battle to help recruit more men. While he was there, in recognition of what he did at Antietam, he was promoted to the rank of lieutenant. And from that point on, the rest of the war for McKinley is spent as a staff officer. So he fights in a few more battles, but for the most part, he is doing staff work. He was on Hayes' staff for a while. He was also on the staff of Winfield Scott Hancock, another name that's come up in this series. And just before the war ended, he was promoted to the rank of major. And that had a big impact on him. In fact, for the rest of his life, even as President of the United States, he preferred above all else to be called Major McKinley, because he said that was something he knew he had earned. So let's take a look at the post-war career of Major McKinley. After the Civil War, McKinley decides upon a career in law. So he studies law in Ohio and New York before establishing practice in war in Ohio. And very quickly, he becomes a prominent attorney in Ohio. He's quite successful, very well known. It's in that capacity as an attorney that he meets and marries his wife, Ida, in 1871. And it looks like law is what McKinley will do for his career were it not for Rutherford B. Hayes. When Hayes runs for governor of Ohio, McKinley campaigns on his behalf, and that really opens the door to politics for McKinley. So he's elected to the House of Representatives in 1877 and serves in the House for about 14 years. And while there, he is a strong proponent of the gold standard, which will become important here in just a couple of minutes, which is keeping U.S. currency tied to gold instead of silver. And he also becomes known as really a bulldog for protective tariffs. In fact, if you remember in the Harrison video, we talked about Benjamin Harrison signing a particularly severe protective tariff into law. That was the McKinley tariff. That was a tariff that was proposed and forwarded by McKinley. So his career continues to rise. He is elected to the governorship of Ohio in 1891. He serves 2 terms as governor. Is really kind of seen as a moderate. He doesn't really do very much to rock the boat as governor of Ohio. But Ohio is a very important state politically. And so 1896, he's convinced to run for the nomination of for president. and he mounts really one of the most important presidential campaigns in U.S. history. So let's take a look at McKinley as president. So very quickly, to understand why the McKinley campaign in 1896 was so important, you have to understand how it worked prior to that. So the way you raised money for a presidential campaign prior to 1896 was you went to elected representatives, elected officials in your party, and you basically told them, hey, I'm running for office, give me some of your money. And so you raised money for your own campaign from members of your own party, which worked, but you don't get a lot of money that way. So what happens is McKinley's campaign manager, who is Mark Hanna, who you see here on the right from Cleveland, prominent businessman in Cleveland, goes to businessmen and says, look, the key issue in the election of 1896 is whether the United States will stay on the gold standard or go to silver, which is what McKinley's opponent, William Jennings Bryan, favors. Gold standard is great if you already have money. Silver is okay if you don't, because it'll put more money in circulation, and that way you'll get a little bit of money in your pocket. So Mark Hanna goes to businessmen and says, look, the silver standard will be terrible for businessmen. You're a businessman. You want McKinley to win because McKinley will keep us on the gold standard, and you'll get very, very rich. So how important is it to you that William McKinley gets elected? You can just write a check. So using the traditional method, William Jennings Bryan campaigns and raises about $500,000 for his election. And McKinley and Hanna raised $3.5 million in 1896. It's just an unbelievable amount of money. And in fact, one of the lasting things of this election, in addition to fundamentally changing how campaign finances work, is the most visible thing of a presidential election, and that is the button, the campaign button. They had so much money to burn in 1896 that they started flooding the market with buttons, which are a relatively new invention at the time, but pin-back buttons started with the election of 1896. So McKinley handily wins the election and gets into office in 1897, and very quickly, about a year into his first term, the thing that McKinley is best known for as president occurs, and that is the war with Spain in 1898. Cuba is seeking independence from Spain. Reprisals against Cuba on the part of the Spanish are very harsh, very severe. Gets the United States angry with Spain. So there's already trouble brewing. As a show of force, McKinley sends the USS Maine to Havana, and while the ship is there, it explodes. It sinks with heavy loss of life. And at the time, Spain is blamed for the sinking, when in reality it was almost certainly an accident. And so that's all the cause that's needed for the United States to go to war with Spain. It's a one-sided war. The United States wins the war easily. And what happens as a result is that the United States becomes an international power for the first time. The United States takes over control of the Philippines. They annex Hawaii. They occupy Cuba for a while, but that doesn't obviously become United States territory. And so under McKinley's leadership, for the first time, the United States is working on the world stage, whereas previously the United States was really more concerned with its own interest in growing its own economy and becoming a bigger nation. And so it's as a result of the war with Spain and McKinley's popularity, and he really was a very popular president at the time, that he handily wins re-election in the election of 1900. And so his second term starts out kind of riding the crest of the war with Spain and the victory against Spain. But it all comes crashing down not too long into his second term. So let's talk about that next. So McKinley is inaugurated for his second term in March 1901. And he starts out his second term by traveling around the United States with his wife, Ida. They go out west, they go to the Pacific Northwest, and then they come back east, and their trip is going to finish up at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo in September 1901. While he's at the exposition, he is basically doing a presidential meet and greet, and this is an amazing photograph. This is the receiving line at the Pan American Exposition in September 1901. That's McKinley is third from the right there, looking at the camera with tux on, and just probably just a couple of minutes after this photograph was taken, something happened. Let's talk about that next. So waiting in line at the exposition was this man, Leon Czolgosz, who was born in Detroit but grew up in Cleveland and had a very hard life. His family struggled to make ends meet. And while in Cleveland, he attended a speech by Emma Goldman, who was probably one of the best known anarchists in the world at the time. And Czolgosz decided that he would do what he could to further the anarchist cause. And what he decided upon was that by assassinating McKinley, he would end wealth inequality in the United States. And so when he got up to McKinley in the receiving line, he shot him twice in the abdomen with a handgun that he had concealed under a handkerchief. And so at first it looked like McKinley was on the road to recovery. He seemed to be rallying, but about a week later he crashed. And so McKinley died of his wounds early in the morning on September 14th of 1901. Czolgosz, you see here, was executed for the crime about a month later in October. And so, here again we have another Ohio president whose life ended tragically because of an assassination. So as always, let's end this by taking a look at presidential first, last, and only. So McKinley was the first president to experience one of the revolutions in industry and technology. He was the first president to ride in an automobile. He is the last American president to have served in the Civil War. And finally, McKinley is the only U.S. president ever to have a parrot as the official White House greeter. He had a pet parrot named Washington Post, and when McKinley would whistle the opening bar to Yankee Doodle, Washington Post would finish the song. And in that capacity, he was the official White House greeter in the McKinley administration. So that's it for William McKinley. Next time, we're going to take a look at William Howard Taft, a man who accomplished his lifelong ambition, which oddly enough was not to be president of the United States. So as always, thanks for joining me. And until I see you next week, stay tuned and stay safe.